Hello, I'm Bill Martin, and welcome to this edition of Worth Quoting, a program sponsored by FCCJ's Open Campus. Today's guest is Dr. Rushworth Kidder, the senior columnist for the Christian Science Monitor, who writes the paper's weekly perspective columns on social issues and trends. A native New Englander, Dr. Kidder was an English professor at Wichita State University for 10 years. He was an honors graduate of Amherst College and received his PhD in English and comparative literature from Columbia University in 1969. While a professor, he wrote 2 books, Dylan Thomas, The Country of the Spirit, E. Cummings, An Introduction to the Poetry. In addition to his weekly column, he writes major series for the Monitor. One of those series, in which he interviewed 22 opinion leaders from around the world, grew into a book entitled An Agenda for the 21st Century, and it was published in 1987. A sequel, recently published in June, Reinventing the Future, Global Goals for the 21st Century. Welcome to Jacksonville.
Thank you, Bill.
To have you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Much traveled and trying to get your column written and sent off to an appropriate place?
Well, sometimes that's more problem than other times.
I'm sure it is.
When you're trying to send things from the road like that.
You have what I think is an interesting experience in that you're already into a second career. You've gone from the teaching profession to a journalist. And I personally think at this point in my life that's an outstanding thing to do, to have more than one career.
You know, it was an interesting experience because when I started with the Monitor as their London correspondent after having taught for 10 years. And when I got to London, which is a wonderful place where the press corps is all, you know, these are people who've slogged through Vietnam and earned their way finally to London. And
right.
I came in as a sort of novice kid on the block. What I discovered was that nearly everybody in the press corps was longing for some kind of an academic appointment. The greatest thing they could think of was to finally get out of journalism and go to a university somewhere and teach.
Isn't that interesting?
And I was just starting the other direction, of course. I'd come from that and think, wow, journalism, let's go.
Students in our classes at an undergraduate level are always interested in, you know, when I leave here, what am I going to do and how do I train for it? I've interviewed some journalists and seen other interviews with journalists. We had Roger Mudd here in town not long ago, and I think he was trained in history. What's your feeling about training for journalism, be it either print or video media today?
I don't think there's anything particularly arcane and mysterious about the subject of journalism. I don't believe it's a discipline the way the Academy ought to and does define a discipline. It doesn't have its own particular approach to a subject matter the way physics is different from history or something. So I'm a bit hard-pressed to understand why it needs a lot of terribly intense professional training in journalism to get to that point. Maybe that just reflects the bias that we have at the Christian Science Monitor, where people join us sort of from all kinds of different fields, upside down and backwards and all sorts of things. But we managed to put together a group of people who have the kind of, well, the kind of common sense is part of it, the capacity to, you know, to like to be with people. Journalism is a people-y business.
Right.
You know, and that's what makes stories good. And finally, the desire to write. What surprises me, and I guess what I'd have to say to students is, if you really want a career in journalism, start by really understanding the craft of writing. Because oddly enough, you're not going to learn it once you get into journalism. It's moving too fast. You don't really have time to go back and shape that sentence just the way it ought to be shaped. If you haven't learned how to do that yourself before that point, it's an interesting circumstance, and as an editor for a while with the paper, I've watched that happen with journalists who sort of come in and reach a plateau and just kind of stay there. So I suppose what I would say is just if you really like writing and really like the way that words work, and love what's going on out there in the world in terms of having a generalist's interest in the place, that's crucial. That's what you need for journalism. The rest you're going to learn along the way.
That's great. Your 2 most recent books have done with futurist issues, global issues, issues taking us into the 21st century. And yet your academic training has almost a historical root to it, comparative literature and so on. Has your interest in those futurist issues come from just a personal interest, or from your serving as a journalist in London, or something that you've just cultivated along the way?
I guess it's sort of grown up along the way. I think we're facing some very serious issues at this point. I think that our problem tends to be that we are so immersed in our present that we don't look either back towards the past for guidance or towards the future to try to figure out where we ought to be going. You know, journalism is defined as a kind of first draft of history, and yet at the same time, what we are trying to do, as any good historian is trying to do, is to say, here's what happened back there, here's what it all meant, and here's the significance of it. You know, in the book that you mentioned, one of the, they were all fascinating interviews, but one that I think back on with great affection at times is the interview with Barbara Tuchman, the historian. And I remember when I went to talk to her in her home in Coscob, Connecticut. She invited me in, sat me down, and we began chatting, and she said, you know, I don't know why you're here. I don't know anything about the future. I've spent all of my life sort of 500 years in the past, that kind of thing. I said, that's exactly why we want you. We don't want the sort of professional futurist's point of view. We want somebody who can understand where it's all come from, draw out the lessons that matter, and begin to steer us in the direction that we ought to go. And it was a terrific interview.
I need to take that to my class tonight. You know, they're always asking me, why am I here in that American history class?
Sure, that's right.
These two books are unusual in their collection of interviews. And interviewing itself is not an easy thing to do. And I'm interested and intrigued with the process, and especially you interview these people in different environments, different places, different times. Yeah. How did you go about approaching those interviews to get the information that you wanted for this book? Did you have a standard process? Did you want to ask them all the same questions, or did you let them go where they wanted to go?
Well, you always start, if you're in a series of this sort, you always start with a consistent question. I mean, you're starting because you want to get at the same kinds of things. But obviously the interviews have a life of their own and take off just as any good conversation does. We spent perhaps, the senior editors of the paper and I, spent perhaps 4 or 5 months just battering out a list of names of people that we thought would be good interviews. We met weekly, sorting through names, adding to the list. We got up to a list of about 300 at one point, any one of whom would have made a terrific interview. Finally cut that down to we thought we were in great shape when we cut it down to 35, you know, knowing we had to go to about half of that, even more.
Right.
And that's where the tough cuts came. The actual interviewing itself, they were probably among the easiest interviews I've ever done because of the nature of the question and the kinds of people that I was talking to. Essentially what I did was to come in and say, look, I've talked to you before on the phone or by letter, you know why I'm here. What I want to know is what's on your agenda for the 21st century? What are the big make it or break it high leverage issues which if we don't get solved we're not going to have a 21st century, or at least not a 21st century any of us really want to live in. Some of the interviews, it depends on the style of the person you're talking to. Some you ask that question and they're very organized and tick off a couple of things and it takes them about a minute and then they stop and you're ready for the next question. Robert McNamara, whom I interviewed in New York one day, took me up to his the room he was in at the club he was staying in, taking the stairs about 3 at a time and leaving me puffing along behind. Sat me down in the chair, he sat on the bed. I turned on my tape machine and I said, you know, what's on your agenda for the 21st century? Well, I use tapes that are half an hour on the side, and I had flipped that tape before I got my second question in.
Is that
Just
right?
sort of yeah. Like that. And some interviews are like that, of course. And at that point, it seems to me what's crucial, what's vital about journalism is that you learn to listen. And not just learn it because you're sort of patiently sitting there having to get through it. You listen because you love to, because it's fascinating. You don't have to be talking yourself in order for the thing to be working, I've found.
Right. Yeah. In your first book, the issues people identified weren't unusual. You know,
not at all.
Nuclear destruction, population, ecology, the debt, those kinds of things. But what I found intriguing were their approaches to those questions, and of course you spread a good sample of people out there from different disciplines, but some of those people had remarkable insights and unusual approaches to things. Seems like Michael Hooker, I believe, you must have loved him. He sort of recommended everybody get into literature. Literature tells the truth, and that was a good way to approach these things.
You know, one of the things that Michael's a philosopher and the president of the University of Maryland at Baltimore County right now, and a fairly young man. And one of the things that I found fascinating about his view of the future was that Well, he starts with the premise, look where technology is taking us. It's clearly taking us, technology and economics, to the point where this notion that X amount of work is going to produce Y amount of substance and income, we're breaking up that equation. Sooner or later, it's going to be clear that you don't have to do anywhere near as much work in order for the society to be very productive and to produce what everybody needs to live. There'll be a great number of people who, in theory at least, wouldn't have to work, and society will be fully capable of supporting that. And in any case, there'll be a lot of people who will not be working anywhere near as long hours or as many, as many days in the week as they once did. So he looks at that and says, what are we going to do with a nation that has vast amounts of leisure time and has never really had to think through the question of leisure time? How are people going to understand what to do with their leisure if they haven't come face to face with some of the things that philosophy and the humanities teaches? Because when you're leisured, that's when you begin to ask the great questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where's it all going? What's it all about anyway? And if you haven't got a way to deal with those questions, life is going to be a very troublesome kind of experience.
Right.
If you're working 12 hours a day and come home exhausted and fall into bed, that's not troublesome in the same way.
Right. That's true.
So, it's little things like that that come out in those interviews.
All of these interviewees, in identifying their issues and talking about the future, they often used, I found words that I thought were sort of old-fashioned in a way, maybe my parents' generation words reoccurring. Trust, faith, compassion, integrity. I don't mean to think that we don't have that anymore, but I mean, I think probably we're a little more cynical about some of that today. But that was a strong reoccurring theme throughout the interviews of this book.
Yeah, it was. There is, you've mentioned that there is obviously this sort of public policy agenda that emerges from the book. This,
Right.
the 6 major global issues that the world has to come to grips with. Underneath that, there's what I've come to call a kind of a private policy agenda as well. The sorts of things that Alexis de Tocqueville first and then Robert Bellah more recently called the habits of the heart. Those sort of inner qualities that if we don't have those, we're not going to survive the 21st century. If you want to, if we are moving into an era where the question of nuclear warfare, which was one of the issues on the agenda, and therefore all of East-West relations, seems to be calming down and turning in a better direction, yet where there still is a fair amount of enmity in the world and different views of things, different ways of looking at things. If you enter into a world of that sort where a global community, which is what we're now building,
Right.
obviously, requires that you operate much more in much more close proximity, mentally as well as physically, to a lot of different cultures that have very different views. You've got to have treaties. You've got to have a much more complex sense of what treaties are than we've had in the past. And I think it was Cicely Bach, the philosopher from Harvard in the book, who made the point that there is no treaty that you can write which, if it's not based on trust, will survive.
Right.
Because there's the law is too complex a thing, and lawyers are too canny about their craft. There's nothing you can write which, if you don't want to have it broken up and violated, somebody can't find a way to weasel through it and break it down. So her point is, unless you have trust between and among nations, you're not going to survive the 21st century. Right. So it's those kinds of qualities, trust and obedience and tolerance and those sorts of things, as well as the sort of public policy agenda that's there. And I guess as far as there being words from our grandparents' age, I suppose that's true. And I guess I don't worry about that. I guess I'm enough of a humanist and a historian to think that the kinds of things that have taken humanity thousands of years to develop and comprehend and understand probably still have a fair amount of validity. No matter how much in the 60s we sort of wanted to throw it all over and invent a brand new vocabulary. We didn't succeed.
Right.
The old vocabulary still has an awful lot of life in it.
Sure. You taught in the 60s, as you indicated, and
Yeah.
I'm sure you speak a good bit college campuses and
I do,
so on.
yeah.
These people are really talking about this generation's leadership for us into the 21st century. These students that are in classes now or have left our classroom in the past 10 years.
Yeah.
What's your sense of that student today in terms of his preparation and his his perspective and attitude towards these issues. And you know, I know that my sense of it, without being too cynical, is that they'll often say to you, "What can I major in where I can make the dollar?" You know, I don't want to take curriculum that's not practical, that's not related to my MBA process or my vocation. Cut out the humanities, cut out the history, and so on. That's going to be a challenge for us, I think, in
Sure
education.
It is. Yeah, it is. I don't know. I've come through various periods in my own career of being sort of depressed at what I see on campuses and being elated at other times. I think we're building a tremendous basis for good, solid leadership in a number of our students. And I guess I go back again and again to the biblical metaphor of the leaven. You know, you don't make a loaf of bread with only the leaven, with only the yeast. In fact, it takes a tiny little bit of it to make things work. In a sense, that's what leadership is all about. And I don't worry at all about whether or not we are producing the cadre of good leaders. I think what tends to trouble us sometimes as we look at what's going on campuses is in fact a reason for us to take a certain amount of comfort. What we've done, as you well know, in the last century is to vastly expand the base of population that's now involved in higher education.
Right.
You know, we're not a country where only 10% of our people go on to college. We're a country where it's up in the 60s and 70%. Now, if that's the case, small wonder then that if we try to compare this to what looked like, as we read our history, the glorious heydays of the Harvards in the 1920s,
Right.
when every student on campus was an absolutely brilliant mind and all of that, that may well have been, because that was only this tiny little skim across the top of society that was taken off. Well, far better, it seems to me, that we take those into the campus at the same time that we're giving as much as possible to as many other people in our society. That's our great strength in this country. I really am convinced of that. From looking at European education systems as well, I think that our real strength is that breadth of the education that we're delivering out there.
I agree. In fact, I heard on NPR this morning that the number of people in rural communities attending and finishing college is increased dramatically in the last 15 years. In fact, the gap between the rural and the urban numbers has narrowed significantly. So,
I'll tell you an interesting point on that. I spoke a while ago to a man named Sojat Moko, who was an Indonesian and was the head of the UN University in Japan. And we were talking about education reform in Tokyo. I mean, I was in Tokyo at one point. And he said, I'll tell you what education reform is all about. It doesn't have to do with trying to trying to tinker with the curriculum to see whether you want 25 or 28 hours in such and such a subject, that kind of thing. Education reform for the 21st century, he said, has to do with the fact that there are now so many students in developing countries that we not only don't have the teachers for them, we don't have the wherewithal to build classrooms. So the question for the future is, how are you going to educate without classrooms? Now, that's true, of course, for our rural populations as well. If the physical proximity to the campus prevents them from actually getting in to take the course, and yet the hunger for education is there, how are we going to deliver that?
yeah. Issues access.
Issues access, the whole technology of things, the question of televised classrooms, of long-distance learning, all these sorts of things are vital issues. And I think, given our technology and this tremendous pool of students that we deal with, the United States is probably best positioned of any country in the world to invent the processes whereby that long-distance learning is going to take place. And frankly, and I certainly don't say this out of anything except a genuine feeling for this fact, it seems to me that institutions such as this one, which are dealing with this whole shift in a population, this whole vast demography of 85,000 students that are out there sort of wondering where to go and how to do this, we're still caught in the bind of building our little campus surrounded by massive parking lots in order that we can physically get students into the same room so that learning can take place. Well, as we begin to break through, as I know you're doing here, we begin to break through that metaphor and realize that there are ways that learning can go on via television and other things at a distance. That's going to radically change what we do in this country. And the blessing for that, I think, will be marginal in this country and will be central in the third world. If we can take that model and use it for educating in places where there is no infrastructure, there isn't even a road, even if you had a car to get from where you were to the university campus.
Right.
If we can cut through that, that's going to be one of the greatest inventions of the 21st century.
Interesting. One of the other themes that reoccurs in your book is the feeling of the need to develop global perspectives. I don't know that that's always been one of the stronger American traits. And maybe we're being too hard on Americans in this case, but obviously that's something those are partnerships, those are barriers that are going to have to be broken down in the future to deal with these global issues. What's your feeling about how we've progressed in our global awareness? And
I think we're getting thrust into it because we can't avoid it. And yet we come from a long and very honorable tradition, as you mentioned, of isolationism. George Washington, in his inaugural address, made the point that the reason that America was so blessed was because it was cut off by this great vast ocean on one side and by this undeveloped frontier on the other from all other foreign nations, and therefore didn't have to enter into treaties. And of course, he's speaking in a period when foreign policy in the courts of Europe was a complex and devious and crafty process, and the more you could cut free of it, the better you would be. But nevertheless, this sense has been with us all along. It's part of the American tradition. And we're finding at this point that simply is not, we're finally, I think, overcoming that.
the marketplace alone is forcing us to address global issues, where we buy our products and who we compete with and so on.
More than that, I think, or along with that, we're beginning to understand that the pattern we now have of isolated little nation states within their own boundaries is not a pattern, it's not a formula for sustainability. It's not going to carry us through the 21st century, if only because what's going on in the third world now, in terms of population explosions and all of those sorts of things, is happening so rapidly and so vigorously that there really isn't going to be any safe haven any longer. There's going to be no barrier that you can go in and hide behind. Witness our attempt to do something with the Mexican border.
Right.
We simply can't. And we're going to have to find a way to come to an accommodation there. And I don't think, I think in that sense it's like osmosis. You know, the way that you sort out keeping a lot of particles going across a barrier in osmosis is to make sure that you've got the balance of the solutions about right, so there's no pressure from one side that pushes them across the other way. You don't do it by setting up a great wall and saying don't come in. You make sure that what's over there doesn't produce the pressures that make people want to flee.
Yeah. I'd like to take some of the few minutes that we have remaining and talk about some things that appear to be right in front of us. I was attending a conference recently in Texas in which one of the major speakers suggested that from his viewpoint of current events in China, Soviet Union, Poland, etc., that the Cold War had been won, and that he saw some dramatic results of these things that are going on in those areas. We face the European Economic Community, but at the same time, the Hungarians are voting out the Communist Party and what have you. What do you, as a futurist, as one interested in future issues, what are your bets on the reforms of Eastern Europe that are coming up, emanating from the Soviet Union and Gorbachev and so on?
I guess my stance is one of rather cautious and rather qualified optimism. I do think that the trend towards democracy is inevitable, and I think what's going on in the Marxist-Leninist theology, not so much in the practical politics, but in the whole theory of Marxist-Leninism, is being shown to be, at bottom, deeply flawed. The fact that the Soviet Union has just recently announced that they have 20 million people living in poverty, in a nation which for 70 years has said, you will endure all kinds of hardships, but this is one thing we'll promise, no poverty. That's all going to pieces. Now, it's cautious, it seems to me, because we as America tend to put so much of our emphasis on personalities. And we look at Gorbachev and say, there, look, we've got the right personality, everything's fine. Personalities are finite. What happens next?
Right.
That seems to me to be the question. China has showed us what happens next in certain areas.
Things can be pulled up short quickly.
Things can be pulled up short. I do think we're on a rising trend. I think if there's a kind of a sine wave of these things, that the baseline is going up. And I think even if we dip down into a pit again, it's not going to be as deep a pit as we were once in down there.
Right. Well, listen, we're about out of time, but what current project do you have going? What are you working towards right now?
what I'm become increasingly interested in is the sixth issue on this agenda, which is the question of the breakdown in public and private ethics. It seems to me that the question of values is at the heart of all of these other global problems. And that's the thing I really want to turn my attention to next.
Well, that's great. And you're back to Maine? You're getting ready to travel back to Maine?
Well, I'm going back to Maine, and we'll, you know, my travels keep me reasonably busy. One of the things I am beginning to bring together, as I say, is a list of people that I want to interview on this question of where ethics takes us. You see, I think as we move into a global community, we don't have communities unless there is a common ethic. And we have almost completely persuaded ourselves that there is no common ethic, that all ethics is relative, and that there's no common ground out there. And what I'm just interested in doing is exploring in as many cultures as possible the sort of common ethical points that we have around the world, so that we can ultimately say, yeah, we not only have a community, but we have, at least in this area, these central things, we share some ethical principles. And I think they're there.
Well, we'll follow those reports in the Monitor and hopefully another book. Dr. Kidder, thanks for being with us today on FCCJ's Worth Quoting.